You have been very foolish, Lou. You have been writing on little bits of paper. The police have been here. They might come back, Lou. They might ask you questions. You're blind, and you can't speak. But you can hear. And that will never do.
Good evening, guys and ghouls, and welcome back to Monster Craze Memoirs, a generational podcast about B-movies. I am your host, Ian Garcia. I'll be truthful and admit that the weekly paycheck is the most important thing to me. Of course, I enjoy my work. I haven't been an actor nearly 30 years without getting pleasure out of the profession. Although I'm afraid I'm typed by now, I'd like to quit the supernatural role every third film and just play an interesting, down-to-earth person. One of these days, I may get my wish. Those words come from an interview with Bela Lugosi published in the New York Herald Tribune sometime in July 1935. At the time, Lugosi was preparing to leave for Great Britain to star in the Hammer film production The Mystery of the Mary Celeste. When he returned stateside in late August, in a separate interview, he was even more candid about his film career. "It's a good business, so I can buy steamship tickets, give tips, and invite the boys for a drink. If I wouldn't make such pictures, maybe trash, I couldn't do it." Already in his early 50s, and despite a long career on stage and screen tracing from the provinces of Hungary to the suburbs of Southern California, he was only just now able to secure a comfortable life for himself and his wife, Lillian. $30,000 house on Outpost Drive in the Hollywood Hills, servants, swimming pool, and guest house, 2 cars, 2 dogs, and, best of all, some actual savings in the bank. In 1931, he had transformed from a relative unknown into the top-billed star of Universal Pictures' biggest moneymaker of the year. But behind the scenes, his newfound infamy as an icon of the new horror genre was underscored by bittersweetness and disappointment. Despite his disciplined fluency in English, his thick accent, now as iconic as his gaze, couldn't be ignored, and he still occasionally struggled with both the idiomatic subtleties of the language and, perhaps more often the case, with the patent stupidity of the dialogue he typically recited. Despite his lingering good looks, he was middle-aged and far past the prime of anything other than a reliable character actor. Besides more down-to-earth people, since his days in the National Theatre of Budapest, Lugosi had always seen himself as full of romantic potential. And indeed, throughout the 20s, whether on the American stage or the silent screen, he could still occasionally find a niche as an exotic lover or a person of intrigue. But that was simply not in the cards for someone so old and so ethnic in Hollywood. Old foreigners played heavies, monsters, and lunatics, and that's just the way that it was. Matters weren't helped by his consistent underappreciation at the very studio that he had all but saved from bankruptcy 6 years ago. When it came to the production of The Black Cat, the first of 4 horror films that would feature Universal's flagship horror stars side by side, whereas Boris Karloff was contracted at a flat fee of $7,500 for 3 weeks of shooting, Lugosi received less than half of that. The studio would continue to lowball Lugosi on future projects, taking cynical advantage of his less demanding personality and the incompetence of his agents. At this time, Universal City was still mired in debt and a general dysfunction when it came to developing projects, so even though Lugosi was technically signed to a non-exclusive contract, and though the horror niche was continuing to prove itself the studio's only source of survival, He frequently had to take roles wherever he could get them just to make ends meet, which especially meant working for Poverty Row Studios in lower quality productions for less pay, and in roles that only furthered his uncharitable association with a financially successful but critically maligned genre. Still, even if his creative ambitions had been disappointed, the humble performer couldn't help it if the torrent of fan mail kept coming in, letting him know that all over the country there were still audiences who loved and appreciated him. To say nothing of the fact that, at the end of the day, a paycheck was a paycheck, and the horror cycle was still going strong. Warts and all, the years 1934 and 1935 had been his most successful since his youth on the Hungarian stage. What no one could predict was just how soon, and how summarily, the golden age of horror was about to come to an end. Only about a week before Lugosi was set to leave for the UK to film The Mystery of the Mary Celeste, the Universal horror film The Raven was screened for the British Board of Film Censors on June 27th. While the film would eventually be passed for general exhibition, the head of the board promptly warned the trades that, owing to public pressure and the escalating depravity of what film producers were foisting on popular audiences, with seemingly no concern for the social good or moral concern, a general and indefinite ban on the importation of horror films was being considered. Since the very beginning, horror films had held a special place not only in the derision of mainstream film critics, but also the rebellious antipathy of moral crusaders and social hygienists. Having already been banned in China, the Netherlands, parts of Canada, The Raven became the subject of considerable outcry from parent groups, town councils, and the press in both the US and especially in Great Britain. By August, the London City Council officially submitted their recommendation that, quote, in addition to their two existing categories of film, U, Universal Exhibition, and A, Adults Only, there should be a third category, H, passed as horrific, i.e., for public presentation when no children under 16 years of age are present. The BBFC in turn implemented this new rating by enacting a sweeping policy of re-review and reclassifying all horror films or terror pictures made since 1929. While the mere limiting of exhibition through the equivalent of a consumer protection rating may not seem terribly extreme, in context where the vast majority of exhibitors and many town councils only allowed for the distribution and exhibition of films with a U certificate, this meant that the United Kingdom, accounting for a full 40% of foreign box office, had effectively banned horror films. For many American studios, this effective elimination of almost half of the international market was enough to put an end to the production of horror films. The killing stroke, however, would be delivered at Universal, the very home of horror itself. Despite several financial hits, particularly in the horror genre, America's largest motion picture studio found itself at a loss of well over $500,000 by the end of the 1935 fiscal year. Studio president Carl Laemmle Jr.'s continued attempts to invest in modernizing the studio and mount lavish productions to boost the company's profile in the midst of the Depression had consistently proved inefficient. Despite this, Laemmle, backed by his father, was prepared to embark once again on a risky prestige venture, an all-talky remake of their 1929 film, Showboat. Company stockholders balked, however, insisting that if the Laemmles wanted another financial disaster, they would have to obtain a production loan from an outside investor for the first time in the studio's 26-year history. Father and son Laemmle ultimately made a deal for a $750,000 loan owed to Charles Rogers Standard Capital Corporation, putting up their own controlling interest in the studio itself as collateral. Showboat would prove to be another of the Laemmle's seemingly endless supply of critically acclaimed and technically financially successful ventures that nonetheless could not make a dent in the studio's disastrous financial situation, the production itself, despite its already hefty price tag, going $300,000 over budget. Things went about how you might expect. Charles Rogers called the loan, and by March 14, 1936, the Laemmles were out, and Universal was under new management. Standard Capital board member J. Cheever Cowden installed as president, and Rogers himself taking over as vice president in charge of production. Under Rogers and Cowden's stewardship, the still struggling Universal saw its production significantly scaled back to focus exclusively on low-budget programmers, musicals, comedies, action films, etc. This new management was also, however, particularly hostile to horror films, and with the wind of the British ban at their backs, either shelved or cancelled all future horror projects. With only one film left in his 3-picture deal with the studio, Lugosi was cast as a shady nightclub owner in the 1936 crime film Postal Inspector, shooting 3 weeks in June for a $5,000 flat fee. Besides this and the swiftly produced victory serial Shadow of Chinatown, Lugosi didn't work and received virtually no income for the rest of the year, what small savings he had quickly drying up. He briefly returned to the stage in March and April of 1937 for the West Coast production of the hit Broadway comedy Tovarich in the role of Commissar Gorochenko, a primary antagonist in the play. Perhaps after Tovarich, he mused to the San Francisco Call Bulletin, "They'll call me for something halfway civilized. No Draculas, white zombies, Shandus, or mysterious Mr. Wongs, I hope." These hopes never panned out. Even when a film adaptation of Tovarich was mounted at Warner Brothers, the part of Gorochenko was given to Basil Rathbone. Then in June, he shot another low-budget serial, Republic's SOS Coast Guard. And then the real dry spell came. He would not work again until the late fall of the following year. On February 13, 1937, Lugosi had signed a $2,000 chattel mortgage with the Citizens National Trust and Savings Bank. By the end of the year, he had been forced to sell both his cars, the bank got his home, and with a new baby due in January, he was forced to apply to the Motion Picture Relief Fund and move into a small apartment along Lankershim Boulevard in the San Fernando Valley. For what it was worth, his marriage was also on the rocks, the culturally conservative Lugosi having always taken umbrage at the idea of the wife performing what should be a husband's duties. Inevitably, his dependency at this time was a serious blow to his sense of self, encouraging the already complexly introverted performer to turn to drinking. Well up to his starring role in The Raven, Lugosi, despite his age, had been a strong, lean figure of impressive cinematic presence. This traumatic period would age him dramatically, and even as his B-movie career picked up again in the early 40s before tapering off again in the 50s, he would never fully recover from the crutch of addiction. The unceremonious decline of Hollywood's first horror icon certainly didn't go unnoticed or sympathized with in the popular press, but sanctimonious calls as to what happened to Bela Lugosi had their obvious answer. The calls weren't coming in because nobody needed or wanted him, and those who would call would only do so if they could get him for peanuts. Already handicapped by ageism and a dearth of roles for first-generation ethnic European performers, he was increasingly no longer typed as just a ghoul or heavy, but as a washout. In a 1940 interview with Modern Screen, he commented, "Horror to me is losing our home as we did, our home into which I had put all of my savings. Horror to me is learning that you cannot influence your destiny. Horror to me is the reptilian sting of the knowledge of my own stupidity, my own lack of foresight, my belief that because I had always worked, I would always work." The Dark Eyes of London, premiering October 19, 1939, was the first British film to be released with the H rating since the creation of the certificate in 1935. Knowing its limited potential nationally, producer John Argyle recruited Lugosi to star as the film's villain, betting that having an American horror icon at the top of the bill would give the production better legs in the American market, where it was distributed by Monogram Pictures the following March as The Human Monster. Argyle would go on to produce Chamber of Horrors the following year, and The Night Has Eyes in 1942, but the reasonable success of these ventures would not be enough overall to stimulate a definitive cycle of British horror. Thus, from a historical perspective, The Dark Eyes of London serves largely as an example of another evolutionary dead end in the development of the genre. A combination of lack of particular cultural affinity for the genre in Great Britain, and a limited capacity to identify exploitable elements that would make production specifically for export sustainable, It appears as yet another example of a conventional mystery that, due to its arguably gratuitous elements of the macabre and the morbid, straddles the borderline between the crime and the horror film. The Dark Eyes of London, or I guess more accurately, The Human Monster, was primarily intended to be exhibited in the States and capitalize on the considerably laxer standards of American film culture relative to strictures in the United Kingdom, even at a time when the Production Code Authority was exerting considerably greater control over film content in the United States. Nonetheless, when considered in the context of national cinema and Britain's own politics of film content and exhibition, it is notable insofar that it was, effectively, one of the first horror films which was conceived and executed for an adult audience. This perhaps not only explains the more grounded plot of the film, but also specifically its more character-focused narrative, as well as what I guess could be charitably described as its emotional subtlety. Contemporary critics on both sides of the Atlantic were wont to note, and not without some admiration, the frequently grim content of the film. Some of its H-rated scenes can still pack quite a punch today, or at least be respected for their technical quality. But what really carries the film is its roundly stellar performances, whether it's Hugh Williams as your predictably dry Detective Inspector Larry Holt, Edmund Ryan as his temporary partner from America, Lieutenant Patrick O'Reilly, Greta Gint as Diana Stewart, the daughter of a murdered man and a surprisingly competent leading lady, and, not least of all, Bela Lugosi himself. The Dark Eyes of London opens quite grimly indeed, with a dead body floating and then washed up half engulfed in the mud of the River Thames. This man is just the fifth body in 8 months to have been discovered in such a manner, all the victims having been heavily insured, their claims met, and London's Criminal Investigation Department left with no evidence of who benefited. This leads Detective Inspector Larry Holt to the door of the Greenwich Insurance Company, owned and operated by Lugosi as the defrocked Dr. Fyodor Orloff. Orloff maintains good standing in the community through his charity, contributing significant amounts of money to a home for blind vagrants run by a white-haired old blind professor named John Dearborn. But from the moment we transition from Inspector Holt's office to Orloff signing a £2,000 loan over to inventor Henry Stewart, it's clear that The Dark Eyes of London is going to be more of a how catch 'em than a who done it. The impression is cemented by Orloff's typical fish-shaking monologue against the narrow-minded medical establishment that declared him brilliant but unbalanced, as well as by the final piercing gaze he gives Stewart before he departs, apparently hypnotically compelling him to visit Dearborn's home the following evening. As Bryan Senn notes in Golden Hours, many of the film's horrific elements seem to be deployed exclusively to play to iconic associations with Lugosi as a star, regardless of whether or not, as in the case of his hypnotic stare, they seem to be motivated by anything in particular. They could have just had Stewart visit the Dearborn home in good faith, and the implication that he is somehow acting outside of his own will only serves to undermine what little suspense can be derived from Orloff's beneficious airs. Of course, when Stewart does arrive at the home for the blind the next evening, he finds not Professor Dearborn, but Dr. Orloff waiting to escort him. Orloff's tour ends at a room overlooking the Thames at the top of a staircase, rather ingeniously shot in full, with both actors facing away from the camera and blocked to obscure what is inside the room. It is only as Orloff moves further to the right, his hand on the open door, and Stewart turns to look at him in morbid shock that we gradually realize what he realizes. Inside the room is Orloff's hideous blind manservant Jake, who rises from some obscure activity with a straitjacket at the ready for the hapless Stewart. Just as Stewart bolts to escape, Orloff slams the door shut, and we hear an agonized wail before dissolving to black. With sequences like this, it's little wonder that a London-based reviewer for the motion picture Herald described the film's competently sustained thrills as achieving such full measure of horrors, or that Variety was compelled to acknowledge that nothing of the sort could be possible to make in America under the current production code enforcement. In some ways, The Dark Eyes of London was simply hearkening back to the sorts of gratuitously morbid content that Universal had once gotten away with, but with reissues of their classic catalog, especially in the case of James Whale's Frankenstein, had been extensively recut and censored. But Argyle's production also considerably ups the ante, perhaps anticipating that, if he must be limited to an adult audience in the UK, he might as well deliver the goods. The next day, a forger named Fred Grogan is extradited from Chicago back to the UK with the wisecracking Lieutenant O'Reilly along for the ride to observe Scotland Yard's investigating practices. When an anonymous party posts bail for Grogan's release, Holt has an undercover officer disguised as a drunken disorderly put in his cell with him. He observes Grogan snatching his newspaper and paying special attention to a cryptic classified ad that, once decoded, seems to suggest that Dr. Orloff is trying to communicate with him. Of course, Orloff has recruited Grogan to forge Stewart's signature on yet another hefty life insurance policy. It's all a tad convoluted, making it easy to fall into the trap of asking a lot of smart, dumb guy questions. Like, how could Orloff know that Grogan would have access to a newspaper? Or that he could decipher the code? Or why didn't the cops just have Grogan tailed when released on bail? At any rate, it's clear now that Orloff is forging life insurance policies and using the Home for the Blind as a front to murder his victims and then anonymously collect on their policies. With another loose end to tie up, he has a Braille message printed up and floated down to a dumb and blind violinist named Lou, who acts as a courier between himself and Jake. That night, Grogan is bathing in his apartment when the lights go out. In another static long shot through the doorway, we watch helpless as Jake's oblong silhouette enters the frame and throws himself at the helpless, naked Grogan.
I took myself a ramble down a sliding line. Jake was a pushing a bramble, and by some I think she can. Yeah, look here. Look at this.
Director Walter Summers stops just short of depicting Jake actually pushing Grogan under the water, but the sum total of details, the sudden power outage, again with no clear explanation, the pregnant pause between the victims realizing what is about to happen and then being attacked, Grogan's nakedness in the face of this hideous brute, all of these contribute to a sense of visceral repulsion and dread that would have been unparalleled even in the Wild West days of pre-code Hollywood. There's definitely a lot of holes in the film's plot, but Argyle Summers and co-screenwriter Patrick Kerwin took absolutely seriously not only the task of finding new ways to horrify spectators, but to actually pinpoint what precisely induces horror. In the case of both Stewart and Grogan's death, and then progressively throughout the narrative, we see the filmmakers astutely building upon the audience's dread in the face of the uncertain and the unusual, only to suddenly and violently provoke them with the realization of what is happening. It is precisely this sudden realization, punctuated by a beat in which the victim themselves as a secondary point of identification for the spectator realizes what is happening, that conveys true horror in the sense of our sudden awareness of violent intrusion and our helplessness in its face. All of this culminates in a climactic scene in which Orloff has Stewart's daughter Diane bound up in his upstairs laboratory after discovering proof that he killed her father. A clear conduit for the audience, Diane watches helplessly as Orloff takes the unconscious Lou, who has been passing Braille notes to the police, drowns him in a tub, and then laughing drags his sopping, lifeless body to the door where he dumps him into the mud flats of the Thames.
Oh, please, don't! 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 Don't!
Ghoulish in the extreme for the time, the filmmakers even insert some stock footage of a falling dummy to represent Lou's corpse plummeting into the river. Even from our current vantage point, I would argue that one would be hard-pressed to argue that we can judge the BBFC's conservative board too harshly in determining that the content of The Dark Eyes of London was simply not appropriate for impressionable young people. In a darkly comic way, this only speaks more to the calculating cynicism and lack of ethics of its filmmakers in having the film distributed in the US. Though arguably more culturally and morally conservative than Great Britain, the Production Code Authority, which, even at the height of its influence, was always more or less just a front of the major studios rather than an independent regulatory board, did not classify films based on age appropriateness, but followed a much simpler pass-or-fail development and approval process that effectively meant that any film receiving the PCA seal was approved for exhibition to all audiences of all ages. Hence, John Argyle's production company had effectively made a film that used its national context as an adult film to push the boundary of violent and morbid content, but always with the calculated agenda of making most of their money in the foreign market, where the same movie would inevitably be seen by much younger spectators. Whatever one thinks about the rights of state boards to regulate popular works on grounds of free speech, such cynical practices inevitably have unforeseen consequences. Need I remind my dear listener that another British horror film previously covered on this podcast, The Quatermass Experiment, was also produced nationally as an adult film, only to be distributed with minor cuts in the US as The Creeping Terror, where a small child attending the film in Oak Park, Illinois, almost literally died of shock. But I'd like to finish things out by talking about Lugosi. The year 1939 was significant for the actor in that it represented something like the beginning of a short-lived comeback. Likely part of the reason that The Dark Eyes of London was produced at all was that studios were coming to renewed awareness of the economic potential of horror movies, even in the midst of international markets becoming more limited. On August 5, 1938, the manager of the struggling Beverly Hills Regina Theater, in a last-ditch effort to save his movie house from bankruptcy, hyped up an extravagant triple feature of Universal's Frankenstein, Dracula, and RKO's Son of Kong. Lugosi himself was invited to make nightly appearances at the screenings, coming on at 10 p.m. to personally introduce the film that had saved Universal, kickstarted the American horror film, and made him famous. The revival screening was a smashing success, which prompted the still struggling Universal Pictures horror adverse management to order new prints of Frankenstein and Dracula to be reissued as a double feature. When the local phenomenon was repeated on a national scale, the studio was forced to reckon with the lingering appetite for the weird and supernatural, and quickly moved to produce their first horror film in 3 years, Roland V. Lee's fan favorite Son of Frankenstein. Lugosi himself ended up taking the role of Igor for a pitiful $500 per week. This despite playing a major role and receiving third billing behind Basil Rathbone as Dr. Frankenstein, and Boris Karloff reprising the role of the monster for the final time in his career. For comparison, Rathbone was making $5,000 a week, and Karloff was getting $3,750 a week. Nonetheless, the resounding success of the film, partially responsible for Universal actually finishing out the year 1939 having realized an actual profit, was enough to illustrate the continued viability of the horror genre in general, and Lugosi's star power in particular. For Universal, this would mark the beginning of their second cycle of horror films, this time oriented around exploiting their pre-existing properties, crossing them over with one another, and cramming them with as many genre icons as possible. For Lugosi, more modestly, it meant a much-needed return to a sustainable income as a horror icon, one that came with a gracious combination of both universal recognition as well as a price tag low enough for even Poverty Row outfits to afford. The Dark Eyes of London was the third film Lugosi made in 1939. There exists a book written by Andy Brooks and Frank J. Dello Stritto called Vampire Over London, Bela Lugosi in Britain, which gives a detailed account of several of the British films in which Lugosi starred, including The Dark Eyes of London. Unfortunately, first published in 2001, the title is long since out of print and there is no ebook available, so I wasn't able to acquire it in time for this episode. But without those details, I'm not that much interested in production trivia anyway. I'd still like to finish out this episode by discussing Lugosi's performance in this film and how it reflects upon his legacy as an actor, for better or for worse. During the investigation of Stewart's murder, Holt is able to convince Diane to apply as a volunteer secretary at Professor Dearborn's home to act as an informant. She soon discovers a broken cufflink belonging to her father in Dearborn's office, and when confronted, we get a startling revelation.
Who is it?
Henry Stewart's daughter.
What is it, my dear?
This belonged to my father. How did it get into this house?
I don't recollect ever seeing it before.
Seeing it? How could you see, Sister Dearborn? Blind? You're no more blind than I am. You're a fake, and you're shielding the man who killed my father.
Since you are so interested, I'll tell you.
Taking off his coat, glasses, fake mustache, and white wig, it is revealed that Professor Dearborn is actually Dr. Orloff.
Yes, I am the man who disposed of your father. And for the same reason, I must now dispose of that poor fool on the bed. Oh, that is my way.
Of course, theatrics and horror once again get in the way of logic here. If Orloff was Dearborn all along, why did he need to use Lou to carry messages to Jake? Couldn't he just go directly? He's already using the blind school as a front, and his being a benefactor certainly gives him a credible reason for frequently being there. Didn't including Lou just create yet another loose end that, this time, ends up being what provokes Jake to defy his master?
Jake! Where's Lou, Jake?
Lou?
He's gone, Jake. Olaf got rid of him. Like he got rid of all the others. Out of the window into the river.
Huh? Lou? Lou! What are you waiting for? Do as I've told you. You kill Lou!
Convoluted plot aside, there is one unintentional achievement to this twist, which is the extent to which it suggests the far greater range that Lugosi possessed as an actor, and which virtually no filmmakers ever exploited, even if in this case it was likely unintentional. Obviously, when we hear Professor Dearborn speaking, we are actually hearing the voice of O.B. Clarence. Lugosi himself would have never been able to pull off a different voice. But even if disguised by another actor's voice, and behind a surprisingly effective combination of makeup and costuming, what cannot be disguised here is Lugosi's physical and facial performance, which goes just as far in completing the illusion, his restraint convincingly portraying a quiet, unassuming old man being taken for a ride, standing in stark contrast to Orloff's obvious shallow effect. As Arthur Lennig acknowledges in the introduction to his biography on the actor, Lugosi's acting style is frequently associated with chewing scenery, with unnatural, stagey mannerisms, which has led both contemporary and future critics to write him off as yet another ham of very limited range. The movies he acted in, even the one that made him the most famous, were generally roughly produced or even downright awful, and Lugosi's performances are often taken as indistinguishable from that aesthetic failure. He rarely rose above or elevated the material he was given, and for perhaps that reason, most of all, he is rarely looked upon with the favor of a Boris Karloff or a Basil Rathbone. In turn, fans of the old Count seem to frequently find themselves compelled to counter these narratives by looking to The Raven or Son of Frankenstein, to argue in favor of Lugosi's unacknowledged subtlety at least on par with his limey contemporaries, who by virtue of their national identity, their own accents and theatrical mannerisms, are associated arbitrarily with refinement and intellect, in contrast to the provincial Hungarian's more brutish and intense approach. But I would argue, for a vindication of Lugosi, one need look no further than The Dark Eyes of London, where the dual role of the more typical Dr. Orloff and Lugosi playing against type as Professor Dearborn clearly illustrates the extent to which the considerable talents that had made him first famous in the Hungarian National Theatre, then more so in Hungarian cinema, and then finally as the ever-enigmatic Count Dracula, had been severely neglected by both filmmakers and film critics. Though he is only playing a character playing another character, Lugosi is nonetheless displaying through these layers of performance an ability to disappear into the part, rather than to merely play a type. Professor Dearborn demonstrates the kind of restraint he could accomplish if he felt it was motivated, or if he were simply given material of higher quality. Indeed, when Dr. Orloff veritably rails against the medical establishment that ruined him, it could very well be Lugosi talking about the film industry itself.
Those narrow-minded, prejudiced medical men, to see how they can rule you. Brilliant, but unbalanced. That was the verdict. And so, I served the blind.
There are many factors that led to Lugosi's bittersweet life, including bad representation by his agency, a personality that simply wasn't molded for the highly competitive, cutthroat world of American film acting, and of course the volatile nature of the film industry itself, veering from boom to bust with the flip of a switch. But he was nonetheless unarguably a victim of American cinema more broadly, simply not demonstrating the vision or imagination for someone of his talents, but of his individual identity. Lugosi should not be looked upon as a wash-up, but as one in a long line of American artists who were political minorities and cultural outsiders, and who, thus, had to work twice as hard to get the same recognition as a native-born or younger contemporary. And while matters of representation may have improved considerably since Lugosi's modest heyday, even more than systemic discrimination, there quite frankly remains a completely starved imagination in American filmmaking, which is partially endemic to the lowest common denominator tendencies of capitalism, as well as, quite frankly, the failure of artists themselves to want to see stories that fall outside the safety of what is familiar to them. I'll therefore finish this episode with a call to any aspiring artists who may be listening, especially younger people. Challenge yourself to imagine stories and parts that reach beyond the conglomerated limits of what dominant culture has reinforced in you as the most immediately preferable. I especially pose this challenge, appropriate to the topic, to those who more than anything want to dip their toes into horror, sci-fi, and other weird fiction. There are entire worlds of dread and horror, terror and repulsion that are not captured by the template of yet another crop of native-born teenagers or 20-somethings. There is a horror that comes from being a stranger in a new land. There is a horror in being a middle-aged husband and new father just trying to eke out a stable life for himself and his family. There are stories to be told, characters to write, and most importantly, there are actual existing people waiting to play them, and to show that these parts are not just types, but part of the vivid range of real, lived, grounded experience.